On June 22nd, 1953, at approximately 3:47 p.m., a 13-year-old boy bent down to retrieve a nickel from the stairwell of a Brooklyn apartment building carrying a canvas newspaper bag that would lead to the arrest of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence operative operating on American soil. His name was Jimmy Bozart. He was 13 years old. And that nickel, which had just fallen from the hand of one of his newspaper customers and landed on the tile floor with a sound he later described as unusually light, had split open on impact to reveal a hollowed-out interior containing a tiny piece of microfilm covered in columns of numbers. By the time federal authorities understood the significance of what Jimmy had discovered, a spy network that had been operating successfully in the United States for nearly a decade would begin to collapse. Jimmy lived at 3403 Foster Avenue in Brooklyn, a working-class neighborhood where apartment buildings lined streets filled with children playing stickball and families who knew each other's routines. He delivered papers for the Brooklyn Eagle, a position he'd held since the previous summer, and he'd grown accustomed to finding coins dropped by subscribers, quarters, and dimes and nickels left as tips or lost during hurried exchanges at doorways. On June 22nd, 1953, one of those coins revealed that the Cold War was being fought not only in distant capitals and diplomatic chambers, but in the ordinary apartment buildings of Brooklyn, New York. Jimmy Bozart lived at 3403 Foster Avenue, approximately 2 miles southeast of Prospect Park, in a section of Brooklyn where apartment buildings constructed in the 1920s housed families navigating the routines of working-class life in the early 1950s. He worked as a delivery boy for the Brooklyn Eagle, a position he'd held since July 1952, and his route covered a 12-block radius that included approximately 160 subscribers who received their evening papers between 3 and 5:30 p.m. on weekdays. His father, James Bozart Sr., worked as a machinist at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a position he'd held since 1947. His mother, Helen, managed the household and took in occasional sewing work from neighbors. According to neighbors interviewed years later, the Bozarts were the kind of family that blended into the fabric of the neighborhood, unremarkable in their ordinariness, notable only for young Jimmy's reliability in delivering papers regardless of weather. Jimmy attended Junior High School 246 on Avenue U, where teachers later described him as an adequate student more interested in baseball than academics. He spent his afternoons walking his delivery route, his evenings doing homework at the kitchen table, and his weekends playing stickball in the street with friends whose fathers also worked at the Navy Yard or drove trucks or operated corner stores throughout the neighborhood. Finding coins during his deliveries was common enough that Jimmy had stopped thinking of it as unusual. Subscribers left quarters on doorsteps as tips. Dimes fell from pockets during hurried exchanges. Nickels rolled under mailboxes and into corners of apartment building lobbies. Jimmy pocketed whatever he found, adding small amounts to the money he earned from his delivery fees, saving toward a new baseball glove he'd been eyeing at the sporting goods store on Kings Highway. On June 22nd, 1953, retrieving a dropped nickel was simply part of the routine of his afternoon route, an action he'd performed dozens of times before without consequence. The nickel that Jimmy bent down to retrieve had landed on the building's tile floor with a sound that struck him, even in the moment, as wrong. Lighter than a coin should sound, less solid. When he picked it up, he found not a single piece of metal, but 2 halves that had separated on impact, revealing that what appeared to be an ordinary 1948 Jefferson nickel was actually a hollow container engineered with precision. Inside the coin's cavity, wedged into a space approximately the diameter of a pencil eraser, was a piece of microfilm no larger than a thumbtack head. Jimmy held the 2 halves of the coin in his left hand and the microfilm in his right, examining them in the dim light of the apartment building stairwell. The coin's interior showed machining marks, evidence of careful construction. The two halves fit together seamlessly when aligned correctly, creating what would appear to any casual observer as a normal nickel. The microfilm itself was translucent, and when Jimmy held it up to the window light, he could see that it contained rows of numbers, approximately 200 individual digits arranged in groups of 5, photographed in such small type that reading them required squinting. According to Jimmy's later statement to federal investigators, his first thought was that he'd found a toy, something from a children's spy kit or a novelty item purchased at a magic shop. His second thought was that keeping it might get him in trouble with the coin's owner. His third thought, which arrived as he walked down the stairs and out onto the street, was that this was something his father should see. Jimmy completed his paper route, a decision he later attributed to not wanting to lose his job by abandoning his deliveries. He finished his rounds by 5:20 p.m., returned home, and showed his father the coin and the microfilm at approximately 5:45 p.m., according to the timeline later reconstructed by FBI investigators. James Bozart Sr. examined the coin under the kitchen light. He examined the microfilm, and he told his son, according to Jimmy's recollection, that this was not a toy. On June 23, 1953, James Bozart Sr. contacted the 61st Precinct of the New York City Police Department and reported that his son had found what appeared to be a hollow coin containing coded material. A detective named Vincent McGuire, who had served with the precinct since 1949, responded to the call and arrived at the Bozart residence at approximately 11:30 a.m. to examine the evidence. McGuire's report, filed later that day and preserved in NYPD records, documented the coin's construction, the microfilm's dimensions, and his assessment that the item warranted federal attention. He photographed the coin and the microfilm, labeled them as evidence, and contacted the FBI's New York field office at 201 East 69th Street. By 3:00 p.m. on June 23rd, the hollow nickel was in federal custody. Special Agent Robert Blum, assigned to the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, logged the coin into evidence as case file NY65-13324. According to the case file documentation declassified in 1995, Blum immediately recognized the coin as consistent with Soviet intelligence tradecraft. Hollow coins had been described in FBI training materials as a known method for concealing messages during dead drop operations, though no such device had been recovered in the United States prior to June 1953. The microfilm was sent to the FBI's cryptanalysis section in Washington, where specialists photographed it under magnification and attempted to decode the number sequences. The code appeared to use a one-time pad system, a method that required a corresponding key for decryption and was, without that key, essentially unbreakable. Cryptanalysts spent 3 weeks working on the message, testing various decryption approaches, consulting with military intelligence specialists familiar with Soviet coding systems, and ultimately producing no usable results. The investigation had physical evidence of Soviet espionage operations, but lacked the two elements necessary to transform that evidence into actionable intelligence: the identity of the coin's intended recipient and the key needed to decode its message. Between June 1953 and May 1957, the hollow nickel remained in FBI custody at the New York field office, logged as evidence in an active but stalled counterintelligence investigation. According to declassified FBI memoranda from this period, the case was assigned to rotating teams of agents who pursued various investigative approaches without producing significant breakthroughs. Agents interviewed residents of the apartment building at 3403 Foster Avenue, attempting to identify which subscriber might have dropped the coin. The building housed 47 separate apartments. None of the residents, when questioned, reported losing a hollow coin or demonstrated knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations. Cryptanalysts continued periodic attempts to decode the microfilm, testing new approaches as they became available through consultations with military intelligence agencies. The National Security Agency, established in 1952, provided technical assistance in analyzing the number sequences. No progress was documented. The FBI expanded its investigation to include surveillance of known Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in New York City, monitoring dead drop locations previously identified. Through other cases, and cross-referencing the hollow nickel discovery with other ongoing espionage investigations. The case generated extensive documentation, but no suspects. During this same period, other Soviet espionage cases occupied federal investigators' attention. The Rosenberg case had concluded with executions in June 1953, the same month the hollow nickel was discovered. Additional cases involving suspected atomic espionage and State Department leaks consumed investigative resources. The hollow nickel, lacking any suspect or clear connection to classified information, became what FBI supervisors later characterized as a low-priority cold case, maintained in active status primarily because the physical evidence was undeniably authentic. On May 6, 1957, Reino Heihanen walked into the American Embassy in Paris and requested political asylum. He was 35 years old, a Finnish-born Soviet intelligence officer who had been operating in the United States undercover since 1952, and he was fleeing what he believed was imminent execution by his own superiors in Moscow. Heihanen had been recalled to the Soviet Union in late April 1957, ostensibly for reassignment. According to his later testimony to CIA debriefing officers, he understood that such recalls frequently resulted in arrest and execution for officers suspected of incompetence or disloyalty. His performance as an intelligence operative had deteriorated significantly over the previous 2 years, compromised by alcoholism and what debriefing records describe as increasing paranoia about surveillance. Rather than board his scheduled flight to Moscow, he had traveled to Paris and presented himself to American authorities. The initial debriefing began on May 7, 1957, at a secure CIA facility outside Paris. Heihanen was questioned by officers from the CIA's Soviet Russia division, working in coordination with FBI counterintelligence specialists who flew to Paris specifically for these sessions. Over the following 3 weeks, according to debriefing transcripts declassified in 2007, Heihanen provided detailed information about Soviet intelligence operations in the United States, including his own activities and those of his superior officer, a man he knew only by the codename Mark. Heihanen described his role as a courier and support operative. He had maintained several apartments in New York City and Newark under various aliases. He had serviced dead drops, locations where messages and materials were left for retrieval by other operatives. He had photographed documents using miniature cameras. He had received instructions through coded radio broadcasts and messages concealed in magazines purchased at newsstands. During his 8th debriefing session, conducted on May 23, 1957, Heihanen mentioned the communication methods used by his network. He described hollow coins as containers for microfilm messages, a standard Soviet tradecraft technique. He stated that he had received approximately a dozen such coins during his 5 years in the United States, and that he had lost one, dropped accidentally, sometime in 1953, location unknown. FBI agents present at the debriefing immediately requested details about the lost coin. Heihanen could not remember exactly when or where he had dropped it, stating only that it had occurred in Brooklyn during the summer or fall of 1953, possibly while he was making a payment or during some routine activity he could no longer recall with precision. On May 24, 1957, FBI agents retrieved the hollow nickel from evidence storage in New York and sent photographs to Paris. When shown these photographs during his debriefing session on May 27th, Heihanen identified the coin immediately. It was the message he had lost. It had been intended not for him, but for Mark, his superior officer in the Soviet intelligence network operating in New York. The man Heihanen described was approximately 55 years old, of medium height and build, with thinning gray hair and a quiet demeanor that allowed him to blend into any environment without attracting notice. According to debriefing transcripts, Heihanen had worked under Mark's supervision since his arrival in the United States in 1952, receiving instructions through periodic meetings and dead-drop communications, though he had never learned his superior's real name or background. Mark operated undercover as an artist and photographer, Heihanen stated. He maintained a studio somewhere in Brooklyn, though Heihanen had only visited the location once and could not remember the exact address. He spoke fluent English with a slight accent Heihanen could not identify. He was disciplined, methodical, and committed to his intelligence work in ways that Heihanen, by his own admission, was not. Heihanen provided additional details during subsequent debriefing sessions. Mark had been in the United States since at least 1948, possibly earlier. He controlled a network of operatives and sources whose identities Heihanen did not know. He communicated with Moscow through coded radio transmissions and microfilm messages concealed in hollow coins, bolts, and other innocuous objects. He had expressed disappointment in Heihanen's performance, particularly regarding the younger officer's drinking and his carelessness in operational security. FBI agents compiled this information into a profile and began cross-referencing it with surveillance records of known Soviet intelligence officers operating in New York. The description matched no currently identified Soviet operatives working under diplomatic cover. This suggested that Mark was operating under deep cover, presenting himself as an ordinary American citizen rather than as a foreign national with official status. The breakthrough came through basic investigative work. FBI agents canvassed Brooklyn neighborhoods, showing Heihanen photographs of locations and asking if any seemed familiar. On June 15, 1957, Heihanen identified a building at 252 Fulton Street. He had visited Mark's studio there once, he stated, approximately 3 years earlier. Building records showed that a tenant named Emil R. Goldfuss had rented a studio on the 5th floor since 1948, listing his occupation as artist and photographer. On June 21, 1957, at approximately 7:15 a.m., 4 FBI agents entered room 839 of the Hotel Latham at 4 East 28th Street in Manhattan and arrested Emil R. Goldfuss on charges of espionage. Goldfuss had been staying at the hotel since June 17th, while his studio was being painted, according to hotel records later subpoenaed during the investigation. According to the arrest report filed by Special Agent Edward Gamber, Goldfuss was awake and dressed when agents knocked on the door. He opened it without hesitation. When agents identified themselves and stated that he was under arrest, Goldfuss looked at them for several seconds, then said, "I'd been expecting you." He did not resist. He did not ask for an attorney. He simply stood and allowed himself to be handcuffed. A search of room 839, conducted immediately following the arrest, yielded items that confirmed Goldfuss's identity as a Soviet intelligence operative. There were 3 hollowed-out containers similar to the nickel found in Brooklyn, including a hollowed-out bolt and a battery designed to conceal microfilm. There were several sheets of paper containing columns of numbers written in pencil. There were $4,000 in cash in various denominations, and there was a birth certificate for Emil R. Goldfuss, issued in New York in 1902, that FBI document specialists would later determine was fraudulent. A subsequent search of Goldfuss's studio at 252 Fulton Street, executed with a warrant obtained that same morning, produced additional evidence. Agents found shortwave radio equipment capable of receiving coded transmissions from Moscow. They found cipher pads used for encoding and decoding messages. They found photography equipment, including several cameras and developing materials. They found maps of the United States with certain locations marked in pencil. And they found paintings and artist supplies that appeared to represent genuine artistic work, suggesting that Goldfuss's cover as an artist had included actual practice of the craft. The man arrested as Emil R. Goldfuss was actually William August Fisher, born William Genrikhovich Fisher in Newcastle upon Tyne, England, on July 11, 1903. His father, Heinrich Fischer, was a Russian revolutionary who had fled to England to avoid arrest by Tsarist authorities. His mother, Lyubov, was also a committed revolutionary. The family returned to Russia in 1921, after the Bolshevik Revolution, settling in Moscow where the young Fischer grew up immersed in Soviet ideology and communist politics. Fischer was recruited by Soviet military intelligence in 1927 at age 24 and received extensive training in espionage tradecraft, including coding systems, photography, radio operation, and the construction of concealment devices. He served in various intelligence capacities throughout the 1920s and 1930s, operating in Europe under multiple identities. During World War II, according to declassified KGB records released by Russian authorities in 2002, he worked in Soviet counterintelligence, tracking German agents operating behind Soviet lines. In November 1948, Fischer entered the United States illegally using identity documents created from the birth certificate of a real Emil Goldfuss who had died in infancy in 1903. He established himself in New York, first in Manhattan and later in Brooklyn, presenting himself as a semi-successful artist and photographer. His cover was sufficiently developed that he joined artists' organizations, displayed work in small galleries, and maintained friendships with other artists who had no knowledge of his intelligence activities. Fischer's actual role was as a controller, managing a network of Soviet intelligence operatives and sources operating throughout the United States. According to CIA assessments compiled after his arrest, he oversaw the collection of information on subjects ranging from military technology to political developments, serving as a communication link between Soviet handlers in Moscow and sources embedded in American government and industry. He received coded messages through shortwave radio transmissions broadcast from the Soviet Union, decoded them using cipher pads, and transmitted instructions to subordinate operatives through dead drops and concealed messages. The hollow nickel found by Jimmy Bozart in June 1953 had been intended for Fischer, containing instructions from Moscow that he never received because his subordinate, Reino Heihanen, had lost it on a Brooklyn street before delivery could be completed. On October 14, 1957, United States versus Rudolf Ivanovich Abel began in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York. The defendant, who had been operating under the name Emil R. Goldfuss, had been formally charged on August 7th with 3 counts: conspiracy to transmit United States defense and atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, conspiracy to gather such information, and conspiracy to act as an agent of a foreign government without notifying the Secretary of State. The presiding judge was Mortimer W. Byers. The prosecution was led by Assistant United States Attorney William F. Tompkins. The defense attorney was James B. Donovan, a former general counsel of the Office of Strategic Services who had been appointed by the court after Abel indicated he had no funds to hire private counsel and no desire to accept representation from attorneys with Communist Party affiliations who had offered their services. The trial lasted 11 days. According to court transcripts preserved in the National Archives, the prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony from Reino Heihanen, who described Abel's role as a Soviet intelligence controller and detailed the communication methods used by the network. Heihanen testified for 3 days, describing dead drops in Central Park and Riverside Park, coded messages transmitted through shortwave radio, and the photographic equipment used to reduce documents to microfilm. He identified Abel in court as the man he had known as Mark. The prosecution also presented physical evidence seized from Abel's hotel room and studio. FBI special agents testified about the hollowed-out containers, the cipher pads, the shortwave radio equipment, and the $4,000 in cash. Cryptanalysts testified about the coding systems used by Soviet intelligence. Document examiners testified about the fraudulent birth certificate and identity papers found in Abel's possession. Abel did not testify in his own defense. According to Donovan's later account, preserved in his 1964 book, Strangers on a Bridge, Abel maintained that he would not assist the prosecution by confirming or denying any facts, nor would he compromise his intelligence training by revealing operational details under cross-examination. Donovan's defense strategy focused on challenging the legality of Abel's arrest and arguing that the evidence obtained from his hotel room should be suppressed as the product of an illegal search. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 45 minutes. On October 25, 1957, they returned a guilty verdict on all 3 counts. Judge Byers scheduled sentencing for November 15th. At the sentencing hearing, Donovan argued that Abel should not receive the death penalty, which was possible under the espionage statutes, noting that Abel might prove valuable in a future prisoner exchange. The judge sentenced Abel to 30 years in federal prison, to be served consecutively on each count, for a total of 30 years. Abel was transported to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, to begin serving his sentence. Between November 1957 and February 1962, Rudolph Abel remained in federal custody, first at the penitentiary in Atlanta, and later, beginning in April 1961, at the Federal Detention Center in McAlester, Oklahoma. Prison records indicate that he was a model prisoner who spent his time reading, painting, and maintaining correspondence with his wife and daughter in the Soviet Union through monitored channels. He refused all requests from American intelligence officials to cooperate in debriefings or to provide information about Soviet intelligence operations. While Abel served his sentence, events were unfolding that would eventually lead to his release. On May 1, 1960, at approximately 6:26 a.m. Moscow time, a Soviet surface-to-air missile struck a Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance aircraft piloted by Francis Gary Powers over Sverdlovsk in the Soviet Union. The aircraft, which had taken off from Peshawar, Pakistan, was conducting a high-altitude photography mission over Soviet military installations when it was hit at approximately 70,000 feet. Powers parachuted from the damaged aircraft and was captured alive by Soviet forces. The incident created significant diplomatic tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. President Eisenhower initially denied that the U-2 had been conducting espionage operations, claiming it was a weather research aircraft that had strayed off course. When the Soviets produced Powers, who had survived and confessed to his espionage mission, the American government was forced to acknowledge the surveillance program's existence. Powers was tried in Moscow on August 17, 1960, on charges of espionage. He pleaded guilty. On August 19th, he was sentenced to 10 years of confinement, 3 years in prison, followed by 7 years in a labor camp. Soviet authorities made clear through diplomatic channels that they considered Powers a valuable asset who might be exchanged for Soviet intelligence officers held in Western custody. By late 1960, according to declassified State Department memoranda, discussions had begun within the American government about the possibility of a prisoner exchange. The most obvious candidate for such an exchange was Rudolph Abel, the highest-ranking Soviet intelligence officer in American custody. In February 1961, the CIA contacted James Donovan, who had defended Able at trial, and asked if he would serve as a private citizen negotiator for a potential exchange. On February 10, 1962, at approximately 8:20 a.m., Rudolf Abel stood at the western end of Glienicke Bridge, spanning the Havel River between West Berlin and Potsdam in East Germany. The bridge, which connected the American sector of Berlin to Soviet-controlled territory, had been selected by negotiators as the location for a simultaneous exchange of prisoners. Able would be released to Soviet custody. Francis Gary Powers would be released to American custody. The exchange would occur at the bridge's midpoint, marked by a white line painted on the roadway designating the boundary between jurisdictions. According to CIA operational reports declassified in 1998, Able was transported to the bridge from the detention facility in McAllister by federal agents who had flown with him to West Berlin via military aircraft. He had been informed of the exchange arrangement on February 8th. Powers had been transported from his Soviet prison to East Germany by KGB officers and was being held in a building approximately 1 mile from the bridge. The exchange was scheduled for 8:52 a.m. At that time, both men would begin walking toward the center of the bridge from opposite ends. American officials would accompany Able to the midpoint. Soviet officials would accompany Powers. At the white line, the men would pass each other, and custody would transfer simultaneously. The operation proceeded according to this choreography. At 8:52 a.m., Able began walking east across the bridge, accompanied by 2 CIA officers. Powers began walking west, accompanied by 2 KGB officers. The temperature was approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Light snow was falling. The bridge was closed to all other traffic. Observers from both sides watched from positions at each end of the span. The 2 men passed each other at the white line at 8:56 a.m., according to CIA cable traffic sent from West Berlin that morning. Neither spoke. Able continued walking into Soviet custody. Powers continued walking into American custody. By 9:04 a.m., both men had reached their respective ends of the bridge. Able was driven to Potsdam and then to Moscow. Powers was driven to Tempelhof Airport in West Berlin and then flown to the United States for debriefing. Rudolf Able returned to Moscow, where he was awarded the Order of Lenin and given the rank of colonel in the KGB. He spent the remaining 9 years of his life teaching intelligence tradecraft at the KGB Training Academy and advising on operations involving deep cover operatives in Western countries. He died on November 15, 1971, at age 68, from lung cancer, and was buried with full honors in Moscow's Donskoy Cemetery. The Soviet government did not publicly acknowledge his intelligence career until after his death. Francis Gary Powers returned to the United States, where he underwent extensive CIA debriefing over several months. He was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing during his capture and subsequent confession, though his cooperation with Soviet interrogators generated controversy among some military officials who believed he should have resisted more vigorously. He worked as a test pilot for Lockheed Corporation until 1970, then became a helicopter traffic reporter for a Los Angeles radio station. On August 1, 1977, his helicopter crashed in Encino, California, while covering a breaking news story. He was 47 years old. Reino Heihanen, whose defection had initiated the chain of events leading to Abel's arrest, never witnessed the prisoner exchange. He died on May 9, 1961, in a traffic accident on the Pennsylvania Turnpike near Harrisburg. He was 39 years old. The circumstances of the crash, which involved Heihanen's vehicle crossing into oncoming traffic, generated speculation among some intelligence officials about possible Soviet retaliation, though investigations concluded the accident was consistent with Heihanen's documented alcohol abuse. Jimmy Bozart continued living in Brooklyn, attended college, and later worked as an accountant for a manufacturing firm in New York. He rarely spoke publicly about finding the hollow coin, according to the few interviews he gave to journalists researching the Abel case in later years. The hollow nickel itself is currently preserved in the Federal Bureau of Investigation's museum at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., displayed alongside other artifacts from significant counterintelligence cases. The story of Jimmy Bozart and the hollow nickel is not a simple narrative about a boy who accidentally uncovered a spy. It is a story about how history pivots on moments of pure chance, about how the elaborate architecture of Cold War espionage could be dismantled by a coin dropped on a tile floor, about how the most sophisticated intelligence operations remain vulnerable to the randomness of ordinary life. It is a story about how a 13-year-old newspaper delivery boy in Brooklyn became, through no intention of his own, a participant in counterintelligence operations he could not have understood, collecting evidence that would contribute to one of the era's most significant spy cases without ever comprehending the weight of what he had found until years later when the full context became public knowledge. It is a story about Rudolph Abel, who spent 9 years building a deep cover identity as an artist in Brooklyn, who controlled intelligence networks with professional competence, who maintained operational security through thousands of small, careful decisions, and whose entire operation was compromised not through any failure of his own tradecraft, but through his subordinates' carelessness in losing a single coin on a street corner. It is a story about Reino Heihanen, whose alcoholism and incompetence made him a liability to Soviet intelligence, whose defection provided American authorities with the breakthrough they needed, and whose death in a highway accident 2 years later left questions about retribution and consequence that would never be definitively answered. It is a story about how espionage, despite its reputation for careful planning and calculated risk, remains subject to accidents and coincidences that no intelligence officer can anticipate or prevent. About how a hollow nickel manufactured with precision in a Soviet workshop, designed to pass unnoticed through countless transactions, failed in its purpose because it split open when it struck a floor at the wrong angle. It is a story about France's Gary Powers, whose capture over Soviet territory created the diplomatic conditions that allowed Abel's return to Moscow, transforming a convicted spy from a permanent prisoner into a tradable asset, whose value increased precisely because of circumstances entirely unrelated to his own case. And it is a story about how the Cold War was fought not only through diplomatic maneuvering in conference rooms and missile deployments on distant borders, but through hollow coins and dead drops and microfilm messages, through the unglamorous work of surveillance and courier operations and code breaking, through the intersection of grand ideological conflict and the mundane details of apartment building stairwells in Brooklyn neighborhoods where families lived ordinary lives, unaware that history was being written in the spaces around them. What made the hollow nickel significant was not just what it revealed about Soviet intelligence operations, but what it demonstrated about the nature of counterintelligence work itself, about how breakthroughs often come not through brilliant deduction, but through accident and chance, about how the most carefully constructed operations can unravel because of events no one could have predicted or controlled, and about how a single piece of evidence, properly understood, can illuminate networks that might otherwise have remained hidden for years. The discovery was simultaneously a triumph of investigative work and a reminder of how much depends on luck, an example of both professional competence and random fortune, depending on which angle you view it from.